During a recent interview, Donald Trump may have, for a split second, accidentally, unwittingly, and for all the wrong reasons, stumbled across a coherent critique of our democracy. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. All right, so apparently, officially, hell has frozen over because I never thought the day would come that I would ever agree with Donald Trump about anything, even for a single sentence. We're talking about the most corrupt president in the history of the United States, someone who is a malignant narcissist and a pathological liar. And yet, just as a broken clock can be right twice a day, it seems that Donald Trump finally, after 78 years on this earth, for 2, 3, or 4 words in a coherent sentence, identified a problem, a legitimate problem with the United States political system. Now, we're going to play some clips here, one of Donald Trump and a couple of others. And I want to say before we get into it, Donald Trump makes this critique for all the wrong reasons and identifies all the wrong symptoms. Okay, he's a malignant narcissist still. It's completely self-serving. And we're going to break this down, and then we're going to take this critique and show how better faith actors, more informed actors, people who actually care about our democracy, take this critique and actually identify real symptoms and real problems with the United States democracy. But first, Donald Trump.
Do you still think that democracy is the most effective form of government?
I do, but it has to be a democracy that's fair. This democracy is, I don't consider us to have much of a democracy right now.
All right, so I'm going to stop right there. I do believe that democracy is the best form of government, but it has to be a democracy which is fair, and he says he doesn't believe that we have much of a democracy right now. Now, the first two things, democracy is the best form of government, but it needs to be fair, I completely agree with. Whether or not we have much of a democracy right now, that's a bit more ambiguous, but again, we're going to address this in subsequent clips. But this is the salient point that Donald Trump briefly, for 13 seconds, has made. And then he's going to ruin it with his malignant narcissism and self-serving nature. Here you go.
They indict their political opponent. Free speech is shot because the press is very dishonest. Very dishonest, I have to say. Even the way you fight me on simple questions like, the border and this, you fight me so much. And I'm saying, why are you fighting me? Do you know, when I first ran, the approval rating of the media was very high. And now it's very low. It may be below Congress, which is pretty hard to believe. People understand what's going on. We need a media that's free and fair, and frankly, if they don't have that, it's very, very hard to straighten out our country.
So, Donald Trump's reason for questioning the quality of our democracy is because he is criticized in the media, because the media calls him out from time to time. He says free speech is shot. That's not true. But that's Donald Trump. That's the reason Donald Trump says that our democracy is in peril, is because he's thin-skinned and he gets criticized. Those are ridiculous reasons. But to the point about how democracy must be fair, and there are serious questions over whether or not the United States democracy is fair, well, I'm going to turn your attention to Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. These are two Harvard professors, two political scientists, two scholars on not only U.S. democracy, but democracies around the world and democratic crises. They just published a book called Tyranny of the Minority, which I'm about 60% of the way through according to my Kindle. And it's a really good book. It's very sobering, and it's basically about how the United States has enshrined a minoritarian rule, a tyranny of the minority, which is getting progressively worse because the minority party, the Republican Party, is exacerbating and exploiting it to their own advantage. Now, they have a great op-ed in The Atlantic. We're not going to read it because it's very long as far as op-eds go, but it's considerably shorter than their book. So if you don't want to buy the book, I would recommend that you take a look at this op-ed called How American Democracy Fell So Far Behind. And again, they analyze the history of the United States. They compare it with modern and historic examples of other democratic republics around the world. They examine minority parties, minority political parties in various other countries as well. So it is well informed, very scholarly. Now, with that said, I want to play a couple of clips from a recent interview in which these two authors are asked point-blank questions, particularly about the GOP. And then again, after we play these clips, we'll break it down further.
What do you make of the Republican Party at this point? I know we read that quote, but is it a force of anti-democratic? Is it effectively an anti-democratic force in American society at present?
Well, in our book, we propose a set of criteria for citizens to evaluate whether a political party is democratic or not.
Yeah.
And to be a loyal Democrat, to be committed to democracy, you have to do three things. You have to accept elections, win or lose. You have to not use violence to gain power, to hold on to power. And then most tricky of all, you have to distance yourself, if you're a party or politician, from groups, allies that undertake those first two violations. And so that third criteria is really important, because often you'll have mainstream parties or politicians wearing suits and ties, looking like normal Democratic politicians, but who turn a blind eye to or justify or excuse these other kinds of violations. And when parties do that, there's a term for that. We call that you're a semi-loyal Democrat.
Yeah.
And in the history of democracies, it's those kinds of political parties that often kill democracies. And so that's why we're worried about today, because we see some of these signs in the United States.
Specifically within the Republican Party. So think about the criteria that he listed. So you have to accept the results of free and fair elections, win or lose. The Republican Party doesn't do that. You have to disavow, reject violence as a way of either seizing or holding on to power. The Republican Party doesn't do that. And then number three, perhaps again most subtly, is you have to distance yourself from those who break the first two rules. And we see that the Republican Party doesn't do that. People like Mitch McConnell, Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, many Republicans have been captured by this cult of personality that doesn't accept the results of free and fair election, that will endorse violence to seize or remain in power. They're enthralled to a cult leader. And those who will support democracy over this cult leader, people like Mitt Romney, people like Adam Kinzinger, people like Liz Cheney, are pushed out of the party, essentially. Now, again, I'm not going to spoil the whole book, but I've gotten to the part, or just past the part, where the professors in question offer about 15 recommendations that they think would restore or take our malnourished democracy and feed it sufficiently, make us more democratic. Things like pass a constitutional amendment establishing a constitutional right to vote for all eligible citizens. Establish automatic registration. We're probably going to do a story about where a state is doing that as we speak. Expand early voting and easy mail-in voting options. Make Election Day a Sunday or national holiday so that work responsibilities will not suppress voter turnout. Restore voting rights to all ex-felons. Restore national voting rights protections, because once upon a time, that was a bipartisan effort. Even, I think, within the past 10 years, it's only under the Trump and Biden administrations that even mainstream Republicans have turned their backs on renewals to the Voting Rights Act and efforts to maximize eligible voter turnout. Basically, get rid of gerrymandering, have nonpartisan election officials preside over elections and voting maps. Abolish the Electoral College, which has a red rural conservative state. No other advanced democratic republic in the world has anything like an indirect election for their nation's highest office. They do it via popular vote. Why shouldn't we? Especially when, as the book establishes, the Electoral College has a history steeped in racism to try to, basically mollify southern states that wanted equal representation in the legislature to northern states, more populated states, and they used their slave population to do it while simultaneously not giving their slaves the right to vote. It's just an absolute tragedy of a system. It's never served its intended purpose. It was, corrupt to begin with. Let's get rid of it. Have proportional voting instead of first past the post. This idea that, if you win 51% of a thing, that you don't get 100% of the positions, that things should be proportional based on the vote. And all the things. Get rid of the Senate filibuster. I've talked about that before, or at least weaken it, because right now the burden is on the majority party to overcome the filibuster. The minority can simply kick back and have a good. And if the filibuster is going to exist, which, by the way, it doesn't in all other advanced nations, you can simply pass legislation through majority rule, basic majority rule. But even if you do want a filibuster, the burden should be on the minority party filibustering. They should be the ones sweating and freaking out and trying to keep it together like it used to be when you used to have a standing filibuster and all the things. Establish term limits and mandatory retirement ages for the Supreme Court, etc. and so forth. I definitely recommend that you check this book out. But the bottom line is this. Even though, again, his reasons are completely self-serving and are all about simply the fact that he's a thin-skinned narcissist who can't handle legitimate criticism from the press, which, by the way, that's what the press is supposed to do. They're supposed to be, the check, one of the checks on power by having an adversarial nature with whoever is in power and being suspicious and asking tough questions. Donald Trump can't handle that. But his point of democracy is the best form of government, but it must be a fair democracy, and questioning whether or not our current democracy is fair. Those are all legitimate points. The fact of the matter is, again, as this book establishes with its title, A Tyranny of the Minority, we are at serious risk compared to any other advanced democratic republic or democracy on earth of succumbing to minority rule. People talk about the tyranny of the majority, tyranny of the majority. Okay, well, that's why you put some things beyond the reach of a simple majority. So civil liberties, impeachment, constitutional amendments. There are some things which should require a super majority. But simple majorities should be able to generally govern, right? I mean, what's the alternative? A tyranny of the minority? Why is that better? If we have to choose between a tyranny of the majority and a tyranny of the minority, well, I'd rather have a tyranny of the majority because at least more people's wishes are represented. It's absolutely insane. But we don't have to have a tyranny of the majority, again, because you can have enshrined civil liberties and certain processes to make sweeping change a bit more difficult. But again, simple majorities should be able to govern. It doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat. The simple majority, the majority should be able to govern. And we have a system in this country with the filibuster, with a completely skewed legislature. I mean, my God, you have a Senate where it's split 50-50, and yet the Democratic caucus represents 40 million more people than the Republican caucus. They say, well, the House of Representatives, that's where it's supposed to balance out. But the House changes hands fairly often. Republicans can stay incredibly competitive in the House of Representatives, even though they represent considerably fewer people. So it's not like that is really good for Democrats either. Then you have the Electoral College with its red rule state conservative advantage. You have a Supreme Court, which is unelected, no mandatory retirement ages, no term limits. It has a 6-3 conservative majority. We haven't had a liberal majority in the United States Supreme Court since like 1970. I mean, it's all the things. The current political system in the United States is affirmative action for conservatives, and it has enshrined minoritarian rule. It is profoundly unfair. And so again, Donald Trump for a brief moment is right for all the wrong reasons, and he has misidentified and misdiagnosed all the wrong symptoms. But there is a legitimate basis by which to question whether or not we have a fair democracy, because in many ways we don't, and we have to take steps to make it as fair as humanly possible. And again, if you want to know why, certainly follow this channel because we talk about the various solutions to this. But I would also recommend that you check out that book, Tyranny of the Minority by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. And again, I'm sure we'll be discussing stuff like that in the future.